both an honor and a privilege to introduce a towering figure in the realms of feminist scholarship, independent publishing, and public intellectual engagement, Urvashi Butalia. Are named synonymous with path-breaking work on gender, partition, oral history, and human rights. Urvashi Butalia stands as a testament to the power of combining academic inquiry with social commitment. Through her writings, activism, and publishing ventures, she has not only chronicled the hidden narratives of the marginalized, but also amplified the voices of those who are often relegated to the footnotes of history. Born in 1952 in Ambala, Haryana, and raised in a politically aware and socially conscious environment, Bhutalia's early life was influenced by the cultural diversity and political ferment of post-independent India. She pursued her education at Miranda House, Delhi University, followed by a master's degree from the University of Delhi. She later earned another postgraduate degree in South Asian studies from the University of London. Her academic training equipped her with tools of historical analysis, but it was her commitment to feminism, to justice, and to storytelling that shaped her into the public intellectual we know today. Urvashi Butalia began her career as a publisher in the late 1970s and soon carved a niche for herself in an industry that was until then largely indifferent to women's writing and feminist perspectives. Her early association with Oxford University Press and later Kali for Women, India's first feminist publishing house, which she co-founded in 1984 with Ritu Menon Ma'am, marked a significant turn in the Indian literary and academic landscape. Kali for Women became a pioneering platform for publishing women-centric, feminist, and socially progressive literature, much of which might otherwise have remained unpublished. Books from this imprint tackled themes ranging from gender-based violence, sexuality, and reproductive rights to caste, communalism, and environmental justice. After parting ways with Kali for Women, Ma'am founded Zubaan Books in 2003. Zubaan, which literally means tongue or voice in several Indian languages, has continued her mission of giving voice to the marginalized, especially women. It has expanded into areas such as children literature, graphic novels, academic texts, and translations, all the while maintaining a sharp feminist and intersectional lens. Ma'am is perhaps best known in academic and public discourse for a seminal work, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, first published 1998. This moving and rigorously researched book brought to light the hitherto neglected human dimensions of the 1947 partition, especially the gendered violence, trauma, and silence experienced by women. In contrast to the macro-political narratives of partition, dominated by the actions of male leaders and elite negotiations, Mann's work foregrounded the personal testimonies, oral histories, and intergenerational legacies of partition survivors. She interviewed hundreds of people across the India-Pakistan divide, curating stories of abduction, wholesale murder, forced conversions, lost homes, and impossible choices. By focusing on these other sides of history, intimate, painful, Urvashi Butalia's work spans a wide spectrum of themes: communalism, state repression, the politics of memory, censorship, resistance, and gender justice. She has written and spoken extensively on the need for a feminist understanding of nationhood, identity, and conflict. For example, her essays on the abduction and recovery of women during the partition, on the life stories of Kashmiri women in conflict zones, or on the experience of domestic workers and rural women in India, all reflect our enduring commitment to intersectional analysis. In addition to her writing, Butalia is a celebrated editor and curator of anthologies that bring together voices from across South Asia. Volumes such as Speaking Peace, Women's Voices from Kashmir, and Making a Difference, Feminist Publishing in the South serve as collective archives of feminist resistance and creativity. She has also been a regular contributor to journals, newspapers, and academic forums, using every platform available to advocate for justice, equality, and inclusion. Her contributions have received national and international recognition. She was awarded the Padma Shri in 2011 by the Government of India for her services to literature and education. She has held fellowships at various prestigious institutions, including the London School of Economics and Columbia University. But more than awards, it is the lasting impact of her work on generations of scholars, writers, and activists that cements her legacy. Urvashi Butalia is a powerful public speaker. Her lectures are known for blending the personal with the political, the analytical with the emotional, and the scholarly with the accessible. She has addressed audiences across the world on subjects ranging from gender and conflict to freedom of expression and feminist publishing. Through these engagements, she not only disseminates knowledge, but builds solidarity and fosters dialogue, hallmarks of her intellectual and activist ethos. It is important to highlight that Butalia has never confined her feminism to the academy or to theory. She is deeply engaged with grassroots activism, civil society movements, and legal advocacy. Her work with survivor groups, women's rights networks, and minority communities reflects a lived and inclusive feminism. In a time when democratic values, freedom of expression, and gender rights are increasingly under threat, Overship Butalia's life and work remind us of the importance of intellectual courage and ethical commitment. Our ability to connect historical inquiry with contemporary urgency makes her not only a chronicler of the past, but also a visionary for the future. To introduce her, therefore, is not merely to present a curriculum vitae, it is to celebrate a life of thought, care, struggle, and resistance. It is also to honor someone who has shaped our collective understanding of history, voice, and silence. It is to be in the presence of someone who exemplifies what it means to be a public intellectual in the truest sense. Please join me in welcoming Urvashi Butalia, author, publisher, feminist historian, and an indomitable voice for justice. Over to you, ma'am.
Aditya, thank you so much for that generous and extensive introduction. I kept wanting to jump in and say, Aditya, bas aur mat bolo, but didn't want to interrupt you. Thank you very much. That's so kind of you. I am delighted and honored to be part of this discussion. And I'm sorry that I gave you such a headache in trying to fix a time, but I'll try to do my best. And thank you everyone who's here for taking the time out. So Aditya asked me to speak on partition and mentioned to me that by and large, this group is made up of undergraduates and scholars who are studying different kinds of histories, but who come from all disciplines. And I was trying to think of how to make sense or how to encapsulate something so vast in a short while. And one of the ways I often do it when I'm speaking about partition is to speak about my own journey into working on partition and what I learned along the way. But today I thought I might do something different. And I thought what I would do is to look at a few stories from partition and talk to you about what they tell us, and therefore also the importance of stories and of oral histories and what we can learn from them. The stories, I've got 3 stories I want to tell you. In one way or the other, each one has to do with loss, but also they have to do with, of course, history, and they have to do with notions of home and belonging and family, and also gender. At the heart of them is gender. I will not be touching on something as vast as the history of women's abductions, although an abducted woman does feature in the stories I'm going to tell you. But just because of the limitations of time, I thought I might keep it to this. So in some ways, the work I did on partition was long ago. And my book was also published now more than 25 years ago. But when you get emotionally entangled with the history, and when that history is very much your own history of generations in your own family, and when you see that history playing out in front of you, not only in personal ways, but in much wider ways in the society in which we live in today, where it is because of the kinds of, I suppose, enmities, or because of the kind of antagonism that is being built up between communities, the history of partition doesn't really leave us. So for me too, I can't let go of it. And also because I have focused so much on storytelling about partition, the stories just keep coming. And I keep sort of taking them in as stories. And sometimes I write about them, sometimes I don't. So of the stories that I'm going to tell you today, the first is a very personal story. It's my mother's and my grandmother's story. And I tell these stories because sometimes I find that stories, people's stories, their experiences are the best way to get a sense of the past and to get a sense of a traumatic past and to get a sense of how multi-layered it is and how complex it is, which is something that, say, for example, conventional political analysis or a political recounting of history may or may not tell you. I do apologize to some of you if you have heard me tell these stories before, because it's not the first time I'm doing it, but they are just important stories to listen to. So as I said, the first story I'm going to tell you is a personal one. It's my grandmother's story. Now, by the time I began exploring partition in the mid-80s, my grandmother, whose name was Dayavanti, but who was later called Aisha, had long been gone. And so at the time, I didn't pay much attention to her story because my focus was on interviewing people who were still alive. But over the years, as I began to revisit my work, her story came back to me each time. And it was almost, and I say this with some hesitation because it sounds a bit artificial. It's the kind of thing fiction writers say, which is not to say that it is artificial because fiction writers say it, but fiction writers often tell you that they wrote X or Y thing because the characters of that story came to them and knocked on their door or sat at their shoulder and said, write about me. And as I got deeper and deeper into my work on partition, I started to feel that more and more my grandmother was at my shoulder demanding that I look at her story. And so I did. I explored it after the fact, after I had finished work on my book. Let me place the story before you, or as much of it as I know. I won't go back into her life, but shall focus on the time of partition. So I've talked elsewhere about belonging to a partition family, a family that was divided by this history. We did not face, my parents, not me, they did not face any physical violence, but their multiple lives were shaped by the history of partition in many ways. So at partition, my mother Subhadra was then living in Delhi. Three of her siblings and her mother were in Lahore in the family house. When it became imminent that partition would happen, my mother traveled to Lahore to bring her family to Delhi. She was a single woman at the time. She was planning to marry. She had no money. And I'm not sure really how she thought she would look after the entire family, but I guess people don't really think practically when emotions are involved. And perhaps she imagined that they would get some compensation for their large home in Lahore, or at least that they would have a place to live. So she went to Lahore to fetch her family. She made this journey twice. The first time she went, she brought two of her siblings back, and then she left them with her older sisters, who were both married, and returned to Lahore to bring her mother and her other brother back. Now, this time round, her brother refused to leave Lahore, and he refused to let my grandmother go either. This meant for my mother that he kept hold of the family property, which was prime property in the heart of Lahore. Not long afterwards, he married and converted to Islam. I'm not sure in which order that happened. And according to him, he made my grandmother convert as well. So from being Dayavanti, she became Aisha. I use the word made her convert because from all accounts that I have, she was a deeply religious person, steeped in Hindu daily prayer, and for her to convert could not have been easy. Whereas for my uncle, it didn't matter too much because religion was not a big thing for him. Added to this for my grandmother was the trauma she already carried. She'd lost both her husband and her young son, the latter in a plane crash on his first flight out, and she was now left to bring up all her children. According to family lore, this trauma came to a head after partition, when she became, as old people in our homes often do, completely alone and isolated. She lost speech, or more correctly, she lost coherent speech and eventually resorted to a kind of babble where she would every now and again try to express herself, but the words had fled, they had gone. She could not capture them. Imagine that overnight she lost almost her entire family, her daughters, one son. They all disappeared across a border she did not know, and she had no communication with them as it was almost impossible to exchange letters across the border. How do you deal with this kind of loss, the overnight loss of your children, and the deafening silence or the lack of explanation about their disappearance? My aunt, my uncle's wife, told me when I met her that every now and again my grandmother would throw all her clothes off, begin shouting, then keening and weeping, and no one could understand what was going on. Over the years, as I worked more on partition and heard more stories, particularly of older women, I began to understand what I was seeing, the trauma of an incomprehensible loss. Where had their families gone? Why were they alone? Who could they talk to? So my question here is, how does history address the question of such loss? Or are such questions not addressed? Because then if they are, it is the state on whose shoulders blame will be laid. Suddenly overnight, my grandmother was a woman without a history. Suddenly memory had no meaning, for there was no one to share her memories with, no one to legitimize them, no one to listen. How does one even begin to describe the nature of such a loss? I'm going to leave my grandmother's story there and move on to my second story, which is completely different. But as I said, all the stories touch on a sense of loss and a question of home and family and belonging and nation, of course. My second story is the story of a man called Rashpal Ahluwalia. That's his real name. And it came to me via random email from him that one day landed in my inbox and which I was really shaken by when I read it. Rashpal turned to me as someone who had worked on partition, as he was seeking to make sense of a loss that he had only become aware of at some point in his adult life. So his story is something like this. At the time of partition, he was an infant, some 10 months old. His extended family were fleeing together to cross the border into India, and three of the men accompanying the refugees, one of them was his father, was sent off by the group to find a safe place to make the crossing into India. I think there were several routes around there, and they were trying to see which was safe. While they were away, the group of women who had been left behind, the children, old people, others who were waiting for their return, were attacked, and many of them were killed. Rashpal's mother and sister died in the attack, and he too was left for dead. Once the attackers fled, a young boy of around 16, who had managed to hide and who was related to the extended family, began to slowly move to find his way to safety when he noticed that the infant, that is Rashpal, was actually alive because he was lying on the ground twitching. He picked him up, wrapped him in his turban, and carried him across the border to a hospital. It was here that Rashpal's mother's brothers, who lived in Amritsar, found their nephew and took him home. Once they heard of the attack, his mother's brothers went from hospital to hospital in Amritsar looking to see if any survivors were there, and people often did that post-partition and often found members of their families. So he was taken home by his uncles. They adopted him and brought him up as their own child. Among the men who had been sent to Recce for a safe crossing was, as I said, Rashpal's father. By the time he returned to where the group had been, the massacre was over. Not finding anyone, he crossed the border at another point and he ended up in a town called Gurdaspur, which is close to Amritsar. Later, once things had settled, he went to Amritsar and visited his wife's brother's home and found his young son there. But he was not allowed to take him away. He was told that it would be too traumatic for the boy to learn about his past and that he needed to wait until the boy had stabilized and recovered from the trauma. That moment never came. He continued to be systematically denied access to his son. Rashpal grew up knowing nothing of this. He did not even know that he actually belonged to another family. And he grew up believing that his uncle's family was his real family. Although there were moments at which questions arose. One of those moments came when he was 10 years old and his real father came to visit. And then as he was leaving, he took him away, or not took him away, but walked with him to the gate. And the man said to him, "Do you know who I am?" And Rashpal said, "No, who are you?" And that man said, "I am your father," which was something that really traumatized the child. And he ran back to his foster parents and said, "This man says he's my father." And they told him, "Don't talk to him. Don't listen to him. You are our child." So that was one of those moments. There were other such moments which were some things that he did not actually take account of until much later, until he was an adult, and when this history became known to him and he started to think back on it. So many years later, by now an adult, married, and with children of his own, he was in the United States as I think he was a professor, when one day he got a phone call from Gurdaspur, and the person at the other end told him that his father had died and left him property, and could he come to Gurdaspur and take possession? He was totally bewildered. To him, his father had been the man who brought him up, and he had already long been dead. It was only gradually that he learned that his real father was the man whose death had prompted that call, a man who all his life had lived but 2 hours away from Rashpal, but who had never been allowed to see his son. In that one moment, Rashpal lost a story, a history that he believed to be his own, and came to face with a silence he could not break, or perhaps he did not want to break, fearful of what he might find at the other end. How would he access his real father's story? How find out what happened to his mother and sister when that father too was gone, the father who adopted him? So as far as he was concerned, the past he knew was either a lie or a blank. He later did go on to learn much more about his past and to find a resolution to the quest that he was on. But I won't talk about that now, unless you want to know more, and we can talk about it at the end. I want to move on now to my third story. So my third story begins for me in Karachi, several years ago, and very likely it also ended in Karachi, but that I don't know because I lost track of the story a while ago. So I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. I was in Karachi for a literary festival, and I met a woman who was invited to the festival to tell her story. And she told a bit of the story, but reluctantly, because she was shaken by the crowds at the festival. And she did not want to be sitting up there on display. When I met her, she was about 84 or 85 years old. Her name was Shehnaz. I learned her story later from her and her children. I went to see them the next day and I spent the day with them. because I was interested in her stories. And this is the story that they told me collectively. At the time of partition, Shehnaz was about 16, and she was actually called Gurbachan, which was her original name, as she belonged to a Sikh family. As happened with many people, the family was fleeing en masse, that family, the extended family, friends, neighbors, they were fleeing from what became Pakistan to what was to become India when they were attacked. She and some of her friends, roughly of the same ages, were kidnapped by the attackers. This too is something we all know. It was a common phenomenon, and each man of the attackers' group took away one young woman for himself. Often these kidnappings resulted in marriages, a very unlikely thing, with the kidnappers, who were also very likely the rapists of the women. But again, I don't have the time to go into that complicated relationship here. But this is how Shehnaz ended up. The man who took her married her, and she converted to Islam, moving from being Gurbachan and taking the name Shehnaz. Now, from all accounts, and accounts we have are from her and her family, she and her husband seem to have had a relatively normal life. Now, this too is something very complex and interesting that we find in partition. We are all aware now of the mass scale on which abductions happened, abductions of women happened, and the coercive marriages in which many abducted women were. But many of those marriages also happened voluntarily. And many abducted women seem to have made a kind of resolution with their abductors. So what exactly was happening there, we don't know. But in Shehnaz's case, the story that is told is that they had a relatively, within quotes, normal life. Together, they had 5 children. Some 12 years into the marriage, they met someone from India who informed Shehnaz and her husband that her parents had actually survived the attack. They hadn't died in it, and they were actually living in a village near Amritsar. So excited at the prospect of the reunion, Shehnaz and her husband and her 5 children actually made a trip to Amritsar and met her parents, and it was a great reunion. Later, when it came to time for them to return, the parents refused to let Shehnaz go back. They kept her back in Amritsar, while her husband then left for Pakistan with their children. The parents basically told her she could not go back with that man. And they said, you have to stay here. You can keep your children if you want, but we won't let you go back with him. Now look at this also very, very strange phenomenon. Here is an adult woman, a mother married with 5 children, and it is the parents whose coercive act is something that she consents to or is pushed into, we don't know, but they keep her back. She is now married to a Sikh, a widower who already had a child and whom she then looked after, and now she returned to her original identity of Gurbachan. Years passed after this, a half century, 50 years to be precise. During that time, she had no idea where her children had gone. It wasn't until the death of her Sikh husband that she moved to the West where her foster son was now living. Now here, I don't know whether her son actually knew her story beforehand or whether he found out when his adoptive mother moved to live with him. But he suggested to her, or he asked her a question. And his question was, how did she manage to forget her 5 children? And she said to him, I have never forgotten them. I have not slept a single night these 50 years without reciting the names of my 5 children on the 5 fingers of my hand. So then the son suggested to her that she try to track her family down. And he put an advertisement in a Pakistani paper saying a mother seeks her children or mother looks for her children. Initially, the ad had no response because it was in English and clearly the family did not read English. But then they put it, somebody advised them to say, put it in an Urdu paper, and they did. And by some amazing stroke of luck, her children, now in their 50s and 60s, and with children of their own, saw it. And in time, the family was reunited. When I met her, she had come to Pakistan. She was on a 3-month visa on compassionate grounds. She had come to meet her children and grandchildren. And she said, this is my home. This is my family. For 50 years, I did not sleep a single night without repeating their names. And now that I am with them, this is where I will live and this is where I will die. And I don't care about visas or anything. And she had gone back to being Shehnaz. So look at her story, Gurbachan to Shehnaz to Gurbachan to Shehnaz. One home to another home to another home to another home. One nation to another nation to another nation to another nation and back to another nation. So 3 stories, each filled with loss. My grandmother lost her family. She lost her language. She lost her home, even though she continued to live in it, and so much more. Rashpal lost her father, one who for much of Rashpal's life lived a mere 2 hours away. Imagine the pain of discovering that after your father is gone, he also, in the death of his adoptive father, lost a family, for the family he believed was his turned out to be someone else altogether. And in the deep desire to seek out information, to somehow visit, to feel, to see the imagine, and see and imagine the place where the separation that was to shape his life happened, he was desperately trying to recover a history that could connect him to someone he felt was his own. That feeling stayed with him all his life. And Shehnaz, in the way her life was manipulated, she lost agency, she regained agency, she lost love, she lost citizenship, and so much more. There are so many echoes of these things in the world in which we live in today in India. So let me ask you this question. What place do these stories of partition have in our understanding of that history? In the many years that I have worked on this subject, the ways in which nations deal with violent and traumatic pasts has continued to interest and fascinate me. And I have wondered if there are any lessons that we can take away from these stories and other stories that we hear all the time. You know, if we look around us at the world, we have plenty of examples of things like truth commissions and tribunals and public hearings and commemorations. But there is another troubling question here, which is these stories. And when Aditya was introducing me, he talked about how much of what I do is also very entangled with emotion. I think these stories are filled with deep hurt, with bewilderment, with trauma that survivors carry within them. Can a structure like the state be expected to address these with any sensitivity? And in expecting this, are we looking to states to intervene into the deepest recesses of our minds and hearts? And is that even desirable? I don't know. I don't have an answer to this because Gaza and Palestine are so much in and so terribly in the news. Years ago, I went to Ramallah in Palestine on the anniversary of the Nakba. And I found the memorial and commemoration of that moment in people's minds extremely moving and very, very rich in its recall of histories that would otherwise be wiped out by an aggressor state, now a genocidal state. In Delhi, in a Gurdwara, in what was once a refugee settlement, that is Jangpura, there is an annual memorial event to honor those people of their community who died in the violence of Rawalpindi. Because my work is on this side of the border, many of the examples that I am giving you are from Hindu and Sikh communities, but there are hundreds of similar examples from across the border. So what do such memorials and events mean? How may we remember them? You will recall that some years ago, our state mooted the idea to remember partition, which I think is a very important thing. But tellingly, what they wanted to remember was the horror of partition. And the thing was called Partition Horrors Day. So even remembering, evoking memory, important though it is for our work, for those of us who are interested and invested in memory, I think we have to remember that memory also is not as harmless, within quotes, as it looks. So how then, in doing memory work, do we guard against the politicization of memory? This said, there are plenty of examples from other countries that show that often people who have faced such losses are filled with questions of why and how, and they need information. And this need for information, I think, is perhaps because people believe that an explanation or in some ways just a visual image of where this violence took place will somehow provide a kind of closure, which may or may not happen. For Rashwal, for example, the past was a complete blank. Who were his parents? What did they look like? What happened during the attack? His mind is filled with questions. And in India and Pakistan, we have no way to access even this basic information. We have no records. And if we are ever able to face up to our memories, we have no real access to information from other people's stories, etc. Rashpal was finally, as I mentioned, able to make a visit to Pakistan at, I think it was at the invitation of a video provider who makes stories of people uniting families across borders. And the one thing that gave him a kind of closure was to go back to the spot where the violence happened and to see, get a sense of the journey that his family had made. I also want to talk a little bit about oral history and ask what people's stories can tell us. A question that I often get asked when I speak about oral history is, how reliable is memory? Memory is contingent, oral narratives. How can you fact check the, I suppose, the reliability or the truthfulness of an oral narrative? I am not really troubled by the reliability question, because I think what we call fact is almost as unreliable as memory might be. And I'll give you an example here, which I often give, which is that years ago, I went along with a large number of people to Bhagalpur in Bihar at the for the People's Union for Democratic Rights. We went to conduct a people's investigation into the anti-Muslim violence that had happened there in Bhagalpur, in which a lot of people were killed. We were a large team. And one of the issues we came up against was how many people actually died in that attack. And we got three sets of figures, one from ordinary people on the ground, one from the police, and one from state officials. All the figures were completely different. And clearly, all the figures were motivated by the particular truth that that particular institution or person wanted to put forward. One of those truths would find its way into documents which would later become the factual evidence-based document for history. So how factual is fact? And is there a way that we can think of orality or oral testimonies and the so-called factual accounts not as competing narratives, but as narratives which nuance each other, which can work together, which can give us then a sense of the histories that we are trying to work with? And Finally, I only want to say that for us here, even today, 75 years after partition, the overwhelming belief seems to be that if you ignore trauma, if you ignore violent histories, they will go away. Or if you retell them with yourself as victim and the other as aggressor, then it's worth remembering them. I think if only things were that simple, but it isn't that simple. And interestingly, this idea that things will go away isn't only a belief that is held by those in power, for whom only the triumphalist narrative holds any meaning, but it is also held by people like many of us who keep saying, why rake all this up again? Why should we start looking at partition? Isn't it done and dusted? Should we not put it away and move on? I am not sure we can move on into the future by ignoring the past, but that's a subject that is up for debate for all of us. So I'm going to stop here. And if you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Aditya, is that all right?
Yes, ma'am, that works. So thank you very much, ma'am, for such an emotional lecture. Now the floor is open for questions. Please raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. Then you can go ahead with the question. Yes, Guru Raj, go ahead.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening,
So,
Guraj.
uh,
Mm.
question is, uh, are there any instances on which there has been sexual violence on teenage boys of either of the side?
Gururaj, I don't know. The thing is, um, there must have been, okay? We have to conclude that there must have been because a lot of children were picked up, both sides, a lot of children were picked up. Some of the narratives we hear are that families adopted them. Some of the narratives we hear are that particularly good-looking children, fair children, children from rich families were picked up because people felt that bringing them into their families would improve the, the way the family looked and so on. We also know that a lot of children were given up for adoption and many were in orphanages. Those numbers tell us something. Also, there are some records of people or women who were abducted. And in those records, there are also some names which look like male names. It's difficult to tell because, for example, Sikh names are quite unisex. So, but there are some names. So I think that because also our countries have not still released the detailed records of partition, of local police stations and others, we don't have too much. We can only speculate, but it seems very, very likely. There is also some work done which might be of interest to you. I think in the the journal of history that JNU brings out, of which Pankaj Jha is the editor. If you can locate that, I think 2 issues back, there was a very, very good essay on children during partition, and you might find something to answer your question there.
All right. Thank you very much, ma'am. Next, we have Ujjwal.
Hello, am I
Go
audible?
ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful lecture. Um, so, ma'am, when you were discussing, like, when you were narrating these 3 stories, particularly the second and the third story, what interested me more was the fact was when you were discussing about the trauma. So certainly your second and the third story was talking about the trauma of the victims. Okay. But I just had a question that when we talk about trauma, and certainly in partition studies, we talk about the trauma of the victim. But I just want to know that in all the interviews that you have taken, have you came across in any of the interviews, did you get a chance to know about the trauma of the perpetrator and how they have kind of tried to negotiate with shame, with pride and shame? And this is just yeah. Did you get a chance?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question, Ujjwal. So the thing is that, as you know, for all of us, it is much easier to talk to the victims rather than to the perpetrators. That was what my experience was also when I was doing the work. Not my experience, it was a choice I made. I didn't want to talk to perpetrators because in my head, the perpetrators were basically horrible people, okay, who went out and killed and so on. It was a very naive assumption. As I got deeper into the research, the scene became, of course, much more complex. And I did not do any extended interviews with perpetrators who had killed people of the other religion. But I did meet some of them and I did have some conversations with them. And there was, as you say, a lot of regret. There was an attempt to grasp what had happened, which almost always ended up in saying it was a kind of madness. And some of them tried to make amends also through doing things like helping other people. But these were all very, very sketchy stories. You know, I didn't get any detailed story. But then this changed for me because I heard when I was in Amritsar interviewing about somebody who was a perpetrator, but who had perpetrated violence on his own family, who had killed members of his own family. So that, for me, that story led me to explore violence, particularly inside Hindu and Sikh families, who, for fear that their families, especially their women, might get killed, abducted, raped, and polluted, they saw it in terms of pollution and purity, by members of the other religion, often took this extreme step of killing people and then excused it as martyrdom or honor killings. So I heard some stories of this from one of the people I interviewed extensively, called Bir Bahadur Singh, who is in my book. And he will, if you read his story, you'll find this backstory of his father killing his sister and various other members in his family. And then I met this man called Mangal Singh, who was one of the perpetrators of family violence of a set of 3 brothers. I did an extensive interview with him. And I was very hesitant to talk to him because I kept feeling sick at the thought of talking to him. But eventually I went, and it was also quite traumatic for me because he turned out to be a really nice man to whom I warmed as the more I talked to him, the more empathy I felt for him. And I asked him a question, and his answer has stayed with me forever, really. I asked him, how did you carry this grief and this guilt with you when you moved to Amritsar after destroying your entire family? And he said in Punjabi, where it sounds much more evocative, he told me that, look, we have put all our forgetting into this land. This Punjab is called Sone ki Chidiya. And he said that we have irrigated this land with our tears. But every year he used to go to a memorial ceremony in the Golden Temple for the same family that he had perpetrated violence on. So, I mean, it's just such a complex thing, but it's difficult to make sense of it. But that changed my idea of who the perpetrator was and the need for talking to perpetrators. Does that answer your question? A bit, anyway.
So thank you, ma'am. Next, we have Yukti. Kindly go ahead with the question.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for an insightful session. My question is very simple. Nowadays, ultranationalism and horrors of partition is intermingled and is used to instill the idea of ultranationalism, increasingly ignoring the idea of trauma and empathy. When you come across such narratives, as a storyteller, as an author, how do you confront such issues in history writing and history understanding?
No, Yukti, that's not a simple question. I mean, it's a very difficult question. I think that the only way to confront it is, it's not, I think we mustn't fall into the trap of whataboutery, that this happened here, that happened there. The only way to confront it is to hold on increasingly to the narratives of friendship and to the desire for people to build ties across borders, and also to tell the stories that we are telling with the motivation of healing. That comes through in your work when you're telling the story, because your way of telling a story could also tell that story as some really horrible story. But I think if we do tell these stories with responsibility and with integrity, that is the only way I can see that we can counter this. Otherwise, the things are stacked very strongly against the narratives that speak of friendship and that speak of the need to cross borders and of healing. But we have to hold on to them. So I'm not sure, I can't offer you a real solution, but I think that is one way of survival.
Sorry. Next, we have Priyam Srivastav.
Uh, Good evening, ma'am.
Good
Uh,
evening.
I was very recently watching your podcast with Anita Anand and William Dalrymple, and your episode on the Empire. And uh, even there, this question came into my mind, which is once again like that: where do we take this discourse of partition history? As in, it's related to the previous question that was just asked. That these are horrors that, like, unlike just like any historical injustice, these cannot be righted in any way, shape, or form. And because partition right now, as it stands, has become the new reality. Like in the earlier days, we read stories of partition that people thought, oh, this is just a temporary thing, and we'll be able to go back to our homes after a few months or after this violence is over. And in the present time, that these borders are now solidified, and unlike other historical wrongs, and we have other truth finding commissions in countries like Australia with the Aboriginals, you know how do we make sure, how do we, like, can there be an attempt at reconciliation in this present environment, where we have extremely hard borders, and in relation to the previous question, glaring levels of ultra nationalism, and in a world which is being marked by hatred on both sides of the border when it comes to religious hate. So how can this discourse of history be used to help reconciliation?
So there's many things in your question, Priyam. First of all, I have no recollection of doing a podcast with William Dalrymple in it. I don't remember it at all. And I don't remember, I may have done something with Anita. Anyway, but thank you for the question. So I think there's many things, as I said. One of the things is, there are two countries. One is Pakistan, one is India. Is it so impossible 75 years after the fact to acknowledge that that has happened? We don't ask the same question about acknowledgement when we're thinking of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, between themselves, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, whose battle was really bloody and full of betrayal and much more recent, have at some level acknowledged the existence of two countries. Of course, the Pakistanis have not given the Bangladeshi state the acknowledgement that it is seeking of having carried out atrocities on them. But they have bad moments and good moments, but they travel to each other's countries, when the moments are good. Is it so difficult for us to acknowledge that Pakistan is now a fact of a geopolitical life fact, real fact? It exists, and that there are people there. That's one thing. Secondly, you referred towards the end saying when feelings have so hardened and when there are so many horrors and so on and so forth. The history of partition is not only a history of horrors. That is exactly what I was saying, that in naming the remembrance of partition as Partition Horrors Day, we do that moment an injustice. Because one, there is no doubt that there was terrible violence there. But what helps us to understand is acknowledging, which we have never done, and neither country has done, that the violence was perpetrated by everybody, and everybody was the victim. So it wasn't like during the Holocaust, if you see the Nazis and the Jews, it was Muslims, Hindus against each other, against themselves, everybody was complicit in the violence. So unless you can identify a clear enemy or a clear victim, it becomes difficult to talk, because then you have to acknowledge your own complicity. And if our states are making enemies of each other, they will never acknowledge their own complicity. Third, there is a huge interest among people in India and in Pakistan to learn about each other's countries, to forget the enmity, to be able to travel to each other's countries. If our governments were strong enough or courageous enough to simply open the borders, like you travel to any other country, you would travel to Pakistan, you would travel on a visa. Terrorists don't go on visas. So we can't beat terrorists. We're going on a visa. You're tracked everywhere. You know where you're going, everything. That will open up a whole range of interconnections which exist. And it's not as if we haven't had them in the past. Travel was possible some time back. It can be possible again if we make it. People still go to meet relatives. They still go when their marriage is across. They still go if they have to. It's not completely impossible, but it's very, very difficult. But if you remember, there was a time when we had on ZET television a channel called Zindagi, which only showed Pakistani serials. They were hugely popular here. If you remember, on Star Plus and other television channels, we had these programs of talent and of music, and we used to have kids from Pakistan come and spend 4 months here. They would be housed in Indian families. They would spend Eid with Indian families and so on. These are small things, but these are families that lead you towards normalization, towards healing. And we must do all of these things, because these are the kind of things that will counter the histories that seek to make it seem as if we are two enemy countries. We are not. Yeah, we've warred with each other, we've attacked each other, but we also have very deep, very old connections. And there are sides to partition where people have helped each other, where women, for example, have been helped by the Indian state, have been helped by the Pakistani state, have done a lot of things. Why is it that we can't remember these things? Where is the will to remember these things? And finally, today, with the internet, there is no reason for us not to have connections. And if you see, Indian middle-class families, pretty much every family living in major cities will have 1 or 2 children studying abroad. It's the same with Pakistan. And Indians and Pakistanis come together in the diaspora to study, to be friends, to attend each other's weddings, and they do away with the differences. That's the kind of thing that we need to learn from.
Thank you, ma'am. Next is Aishwarya. Please go ahead with your question. And please be short.
I should
Good
also be
evening,
short. I
ma'am.
give very long answers. I'll behave.
No,
Yeah.
no, not for you.
Good evening, ma'am. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, Aishwarya, thank you.
So thank you so much for such a compelling lecture. It was an honor to hear from you. Actually, ma'am, my question was pretty simple. The thing is, how do you think partition memories are being preserved, or is it lost in today's younger generation?
Okay, so I don't think that the preservation of memory is an act in itself, Aishwarya. I think it is also that how people engage with those memories. And in today's generation, in the ways in which partition discourse has developed in the last 20, 25 years, you see a lot of things that engage young people. And I think people are responding to that. For example, there are young artists who are now looking at partition and who are looking at their own family histories. And these are artists in their 30s, let's say, mid 20s, 30s, who are doing work which I think reaches out to other youngsters, because these young artists are also very active on things like Instagram and so on. Then there are lots of videos and YouTube programs which people watch all the time. So I'm hoping that that also leads them to sort of engage with each other and see partition not as a forgotten history. And then it's coming back through art, through food, through music, in a whole range of ways, through films. And I'm hoping that some of this speaks to young people. So I don't know, because I don't see what young people engage with that much, but I think that seeing the way in which partition histories are being shared. I mean, there's also the Partition Museum. So many young people work as citizen historians with the Partition Archive. So they are kind of engaging with it in many, many different ways. And the more they engage, the more the preservation of memory will be sustained.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Next we have is Muskan.
Good evening, ma'am. It's a truly privilege to hear you speak. I have read your book, The Other Side of Silence, and it deeply moved me, especially your use of oral narrative.
Is that somebody speaking? I can't hear them.
Yes, ma'am. I also can't hear.
I mean, I
Will
can
you
hear
please
us,
be a bit louder?
but it's not Muskan, because Muskan's, oh yeah, no, yeah, it is Muskan. Huh?
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. It's a truly privilege to hear you speak. I have read your book, The Other Side of Silence, and it deeply moved me, especially your use of oral narratives to recover the submerged voices of partition. So my question is, how did you navigate the ethical challenges of interviewing women survivors who were speaking of trauma they had never shared before?
Hmm. Great question, Muskan. Thank you for asking it. So I think, it's very, very difficult, as you know, to talk to women, especially about trauma they faced, especially about sexual violence. And when I went into the research, I went in thinking, yes, I'm going to talk to both men and women. But in the beginning, it was really impossible to talk to anyone other than the men, because the women never came forward. And when they came forward, or when I managed to get beyond the men to meet the women, it was really difficult to get them to put any time aside, because women don't have leisure time in their life. So somebody pitches up and wants an hour or two of your time to interview you, it's very difficult for them to make the time. Also, they were never alone sitting in the interview. You were always sitting with other members of the family who kept interrupting, who kept demanding something. So it was very, very difficult to do that. When I was interviewing survivors of sexual violence, and there were not that many of them, but I did speak to some of them, it was even more difficult because, first of all, you are opening up a trauma which they have, found a way to deal with or kept hidden. So one of the ethical dilemmas before me was how much, as an interviewer, you have quite a lot of power over the person you're interviewing, and you can push the interview in many different directions. So I took a call and decided that I would never, ever push, and I would just let the person speak what she wanted to say. And also that I would not ask her to go into specifics. So, for example, the first question that came up before me was, how do you talk to somebody about sexual violence in a country where you can hardly talk about sex, and also where there is no vocabulary for sexual violence? So how do you pose the first question even, and then where does the woman find the vocabulary to speak? And then the responsibility on you of what to silence, what to reveal, how much to represent. So I took all these decisions after thinking a lot about them, and I decided that I would not reveal the things the women did not want me to. That if a woman wanted to be silent about something, I would maintain that silence, that I would not push women. I also told myself that, when you're doing work with people who have traumatized pasts, and if you are not professionally qualified to deal with the revelations that come to you, you must not push for those. So I did not push in such a way that I would get some valuable truth and I would destroy the life of the person I was talking to and leave them with the trauma that they would have to deal with. Because there's this notion in oral history that, and which is I find it is a very problematic notion, that you push people to speak, and if they've lived through traumatic past, and once they speak, there'll be some kind of catharsis. That's, I think, a bit of nonsense. So I taught myself all of these things. That's kind of how I dealt with this thing. That's why I talk so much about silence in my book also.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Next we have Atulya.
Hello, ma'am. First of all, thank you very much for that amazing talk. I think it is rather wonderful that you go ahead and talk about all of these topics, which a lot of people find very hard to discuss. With that, I think moving on with the question, considering that there would have been like a major significant change in the society, like after partition, say in how people interacted with each other and other communities, was there, or like how did the survivors note this change in the social fabric in their personal accounts?
Atunya, I think actually there was a change, of course, but in the initial, let's say, several years, survivors were far too busy getting their lives back together. So, in a sense, that is that is where they focused most, and dealing with the loss of home, family, even friends, and so on. And also in the initial 3 years, from 47 to 52, you could go across the border and, say to recover things from your home or something like that. So many people did make those journeys. Many people were unable to, but many people did. I think the change perhaps started coming in only once people's attention was taken away from settling their lives, putting their lives back together. Also, they found ways of memorializing for themselves, like in gurdwaras, in community centers, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that this is something that helped in the healing or anything like that, but I think the changed relationships became evident only much later. I'm not sure if that is an adequate answer, but it's also something, it's an interesting question. I think I'll think more on it. If I come up with anything, I will tell Aditya so he can share it with you.
Yes, I'm sure. Next we have Neil Kamal.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. Mine may be a nonsense question, but one ask. We have been hearing harrowing stories of partition from various forms for long. All put a very gory picture of the partition as it was. Apart from the massacres, killings, converts, do you have any idea how people who have to migrate from one place to other place, how they coped with the times of anxiety? Roughly what percentage had to reach out to doctors, maybe for an anxiety or psychiatry issues or whatever it is? So whether many of them came back to be normal?
Neil Kamal, it's not at all a nonsense question. It's a very important question. And actually, for quite a while, after the partition history started opening up, and there are a lot of people who worked on oral history and so on, that was when at least the first such attempt that I know of, there may have been others, but I think not, started with a group of psychiatrists, one based in Nimhans in Bangalore, who's called Sanjeev Jain, and another one based in Delhi called Alok Sareen, and the third one based in Ludhiana. Name, I always forget his name. It'll come back to me just now. It's very, very unfair because I know him and his name always goes out of my mind. The three of them, all practicing psychiatrists, began to notice, after starting to read a lot about partition, the trauma in the patients who came to them. And that's when they started to think of working on this, and they did some work. And they also went on to do work on mental patients and mental hospitals. And they have done a book, which was published a while ago by Sage. I think, I don't know what it's called, but it is, if you look it up, I think it's just called The Psychological Impact of Partition. It's not on any scale, but they are opening these histories up. And last I heard, there was a big European Union project to look at the psychological impact of this kind of violence and trauma on people in 3 countries, one of which was India and Pakistan. I don't know what has happened on that project, but if you look up Alok and Sanjeev's work, you will get quite a lot of insights from there, and perhaps leads to look at other work. And you could also look at the work of somebody called Shobna Sonpar, who hasn't worked on partition, but has worked on Kashmir. And there, I think Shobna's work is also very interesting in that way.
All right. So next we have is Pranav. Please go ahead with your question.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you so much for those moving stories. What I wanted to ask was that have you ever had the chance to interview any administrator or official in the region connected to these the regions that went through partition horror, and Indian, British, or Pakistani? Anyone, ma'am?
So I did interview officials. They are women officials. They were women who were part of the Central Recovery Operation, and they were all government servants who were given this task of doing it. So, but I'm imagining that you are not talking of those kinds of officials. So some of the administrators, I mean, I have done some sketchy interviews with administrators, but not in any detail. But I did read some first-person accounts of administrators, which were quite helpful. But why do you ask that question? Is there a particular reason? I think,
Yes,
yeah.
ma'am. I wanted to ask that because I wanted to know what was the administration's take on it. I mean, we are aware of the official sources that the official line that goes that the state machinery effectively broke down. But what I wanted to know was that the people involved during that time, what did they go through? How did they feel about the haplessness that was going on, the massacre, the carnage that took place in front of those very eyes? Especially the British people, because it was for them, it was our for it we were just a foreign they were in a foreign land, and for Indian and Pakistanis, they were their own people. So that is why I wanted to know their perspective on it. That's all.
See, there were, so it's not that the administration totally broke down. The administration tried very hard to deal with it, but the scale of the problem was so huge. But given the fact that they were not prepared for it, the job they did can't entirely be dismissed. You can find it wanting, but it can't entirely be dismissed. And there are many accounts. For example, one of the books I read was by a British administrator called Penderal Moon, who was, I think, in Bhawalpur. And it was his personal account of what happened, how he saw what was going on, what he felt about it. There were some army officers who wrote and about even the communalization of the armed forces and what how they had to deal with that. Then there were many other officials who have written personal accounts, and I did read quite a lot of them, and they don't immediately come to mind. But the administration many times did their best. Oh yes, there is also, there is a book by Anis Kidwai, which talks about her husband, who was an official of the Indian government in Missouri, tells his story. He was the brother of Rafi Ahmad Kidwai. So there's plenty of stuff like that. And you will get different perspectives on how the administration dealt with it.
Next we have is Riti. Please go ahead with the question.
Yes, good evening, Professor, and thank you so much for such a wonderful session, ma'am. It's actually not too many chances that we get to understand the history as well as the present situation of tenseness inside the countries, both India and Pakistan, ma'am. Ma'am, I was actually wondering about what exactly happened in the event of the partition with the help of the Muslim League National Guard. Because, ma'am, I was reading Jaswant Singh's book on Jinnah, and over there I came across a couple of pictures and a little bit of information where there were women who were taking part in this a kind of a infantry which was called the Islamic Guard. So, ma'am, according to the book, if there were women who were also fighting for the case of Pakistan, was there any form of an agenda which was external to the kind of agendas that we have read through in our history books? Or was it actually a specific kind of feminism that was being propagated? And ma'am, the second question is actually a little bit of a silly question, but it's actually something which I'm hoping would be the concern for the nation. Ma'am, we've had a partition. We had actually had two partitions in the history of our lives. Ma'am, why do you think the wars take place even today?
A big question.
Yes,
I don't know if I
sorry,
can
ma'am.
answer why wars take place, but I mean, there is no rationale to it. You look at what's happening in the world, they're all at war with each other. And what's the rationale? I mean, for example, why is Israel attacking the Palestinians when their battle is with the Europeans, right? With the Germans? Their battle is why, or with not the Germans as much as with the people who were the Nazis. So that history is the history that has to be it. What have the Palestinians ever done to them? But they are. Why is Russia fighting Ukraine? Because of memories of annexation or larger property. Or wars take place for all kinds of reasons. And they are sustained for all kinds of reasons, which are geopolitical and also power, really all sorts of things. I think that's a very, very big question. To your other question, which I think is a very interesting question, I don't know whether we can read back into a nationalist position where women actively join nationalist forces, in this case, armed forces, or in this case, militant forces, however you describe them, even though they're not the formal army, because of the belief in nationalism and whether we can read feminism into it. What we can certainly read, and we know that now with hindsight from the many examples of women joining voluntarily or coercively violent movements. So if you look at Sri Lanka, or if you look at Nepal in recent years, you will see that. Or even if you look at our own Nakshal movements, there are a lot of women who would have joined those movements. And now increasingly in the Hindu right. And they do so, I think, subscribing to a kind of circumscribed, limited, patriarchal and nationalistic agenda, imagining the nation in their own way. And this takes them out of the house, takes them out of the four walls of the house, gives them access to a certain kind of power and articulation, makes them feel powerful because they can hold weapons and so on, and makes them feel part of something important. And I think those are questions for feminism to reckon with. So I don't think we can read back and say they were feminists, but something happened to them, which was, to use a word I hate, empowering. And we can't dismiss that. And just as a matter of interest, you might be interested in knowing that it wasn't only the League, but it was also on this side. Kashmiri women formed a militia called the Women's Militia, where they learned how to use rifles and where they were taught to use those in order to protect Kashmir and the Indian nation from the raiders' attack. And they were an army or a militia of mixed Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and Sikh women. So you might have raised the feminist question about them too, and it would be a very interesting question.
All right. So we don't have any questions now. So thank you very much, ma'am, for your time, and we really had a great session with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Aditya, and I'm so sorry that you had to chase me, but I'm glad you did. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Okay.